Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Sign the waiver, Elena, Silas Vance snapped, sliding the legal document across the polished mahogany table as if he were dismissing a servant. You don't have the business acumen to handle a legacy this size, and quite frankly, you're an embarrassment to the name. Elena Vance didn't move. She sat in the high-backed leather chair of the estate library, the same chair where her grandmother, Martha Vance, used to sit while teaching her how to read land deeds. The room smelled of old paper and Silas's cloying, expensive sandalwood cologne, a scent he used to mask the stench of desperation that only she seemed to notice. Across the table, Silas leaned forward, his tailored suit jacket straining against his shoulders. He clicked a heavy silver pen, the rhythmic snap-click echoing like a heartbeat against the silence of the witnesses. Beatrice Vance sat to his left, her eyes fixed firmly on her own manicured hands, choosing the comfort of Silas's lies over the discomfort of the truth. Beside her, Cassandra Vance smirked, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet that Elena knew had been bought with money meant for the estate's property taxes. "It's a simple request, Elena," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "We're trying to protect you. You've spent your life playing in the dirt with your little garden projects while Silas has been maintaining the empire. You look exhausted. That blouse you're wearing, is it from a thrift store? It's practically transparent. You're lowering the property value just by sitting there." The lawyers at the end of the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. This was the Vance family dynamic. Silas ruled through fear, Cassandra through ridicule, and Beatrice through silence. Elena looked down at the document. It was a total renunciation of her rights to the northern acreage, the most fertile part of the valley and the site of Martha's original homestead. Silas wanted to sell it to a developer for a strip mall, a move that would destroy the local ecosystem and the legacy Martha had spent 60 years protecting. "I'm not signing it, Silas," she said, her voice calm and steady. The snap-click of the pen stopped instantly. Silas's face didn't just redden, it seemed to darken, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk tie. He stood up, towering over her, invading her personal space with the practiced ease of a bully. "You're a liability," he hissed, his voice low so the lawyers wouldn't catch the full venom. "You've always been a guest in this house, a charity case Martha took in because she felt sorry for your mother. You own nothing, you are nothing. If you don't sign that paper, I will ensure you leave this house with nothing but the rags on your back. No trust fund, no stipend, nothing." Elena felt the cold condensation on the water glass in front of her. She didn't flinch. Instead, her hand drifted to the pocket of her modest cardigan, her fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edge of an iron key Martha had pressed into her palm only hours before she passed. "The lion doesn't roar to prove its power, Elena," Martha had whispered. "It just waits." "I understand your position," Elena said, standing up slowly. She was shorter than him, but she held his gaze until he was the one to blink. "But you seem to be operating under a misunderstanding. You keep talking about your empire, Silas, but the audit on the Vance holdings hasn't been finalized yet, has it?" Silas's eyes narrowed. For a fleeting second, the arrogance flickered, replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of panic. He glanced at the lead attorney, who suddenly found a great deal of interest in his briefcase. "What are you talking about?" Silas demanded. "Just a thought," she replied, picking up her simple canvas bag. She noticed Cassandra looking at the bag with a sneer, completely unaware that inside that bag was a ledger Silas thought had been burned 3 years ago. "Martha always said that a house built on fraud eventually collapses under its own weight. I'd be careful about how much pressure you apply to the foundation." "You're delusional," Cassandra chimed in, though her voice lacked its earlier bite. "You're going to regret this. By tomorrow, your key won't even work in the front door." Elena smiled, a small, knowing expression that didn't reach her eyes. She thought of Julian Thorne, the historian she'd met with in secret, and the documents he'd helped her verify. Silas thought he was the predator in this room, but he was merely a scavenger who had grown fat on a dying lion's scraps. "You're right about one thing, Cassandra," Elena said as she moved toward the heavy oak doors. "The locks are going to be changed. Very soon." She walked out of the library, the sound of her sensible flat striking the marble floor with a rhythmic finality. She didn't look back at the three people who had spent a decade trying to make her feel small. She reached the foyer and stepped out into the cool evening air, pulling her cardigan tight. As she walked toward her modest car, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, but she knew exactly who it was. The Blackwood codicil is verified. He has no idea what's coming in 48 hours. Elena leaned against her car door, looking up at the sprawling, lit-up windows of the Vance Manor. For the first time in her life, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a target. Silas had called her an embarrassment, a liability, and a guest. He was about to find out that the person he'd been stepping on for years was the only thing holding the floor beneath his feet. She started the engine, her gaze fixed on the library window where she could still see Silas's silhouette pacing back and forth. The game had finally begun, and Silas Vance had no idea he'd already lost the first move. The following morning, the scent of stale tea and old parchment filled the cramped back office of the Thorne Historical Society. Elena Vance sat in a velvet chair that had seen better decades, her eyes fixed on the man across the desk. Julian Thorne moved with a quiet, scholarly precision, his fingers tracing the embossed seal on the document she had brought him. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the distant hum of traffic outside the small, dusty window. Julian looked up, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He tapped the yellowed paper with a fountain pen. This wasn't just a footnote in history, and they both knew it. The Blackwood codicil was a surgical strike against the current Vance succession. "Your grandmother was a meticulous woman, Elena," Julian said, his voice low and resonant. "Martha Vance knew exactly what Silas was capable of even 10 years ago. She didn't just write a will, she built a fortress. This codicil doesn't just grant you a portion of the estate. It stipulates that the land the manor sits on, the very foundation of the Vance fortune, was never Silas's to inherit." Elena felt a cold shiver of realization. He's been building his empire on borrowed dirt. Before she could respond, her phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. The caller ID flashed a name that made her jaw tighten: Silas. She hit the speaker button, her pulse steady despite the looming confrontation. "I hope you're enjoying your little vacation from reality," Silas Vance's voice crackled through the line, dripping with his signature brand of casual cruelty. "I'm calling to let you know that I've had Beatrice and Cassandra clear out your mother's old suite this morning. It was long overdue. All that sentimental clutter was an eyesore." Elena's hand clenched into a fist, her nails digging into her palm. "That wasn't yours to touch, Silas. Everything under this roof is mine, Elena. I've already sent the paintings to the local auction house, and Cassandra decided your mother's pearls looked far better on her than they ever did in a velvet box. Consider it a storage fee for the years I've had to tolerate your presence." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Don't bother coming back for your things. I've had the staff leave your suitcases at the gatehouse. You're a guest who has overstayed her welcome. Permanently." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the smell of Julian's pipe tobacco and the sudden, sharp sting of tears Elena refused to let fall. Silas hadn't just evicted her. He had tried to erase the last physical traces of her mother. It was a calculated move designed to break her spirit, witnessed by the very staff who used to look to her for leadership. Julian reached across the desk, his hand hovering near hers in a gesture of silent support. "He's arrogant. He thinks the law is something he can buy and sell like his real estate holdings. He thinks he's the king," Elena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "He has no idea he's just a squatter in Martha's house." She looked down at the document. The codicil was clear. Martha Vance had seen the rot in her son and had bypassed him entirely, deeding the Blackwood acreage, the heart of the estate, to Elena upon her 25th birthday. Silas had suppressed the document, but he hadn't accounted for Julian's archives. "The founder's gala is in 48 hours, Elena murmured, her mind spinning with the cold geometry of revenge. He's planning to announce the new development project then. He's invited the governor, the board, and every major investor in the state. Julian nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. He's setting the stage for his own execution. If you present this then with the original deed in hand, his contracts won't be worth the paper they're printed on. He'll be exposed as a fraud in front of the very people he's trying to impress. Elena stood up, the weight of the last 5 years finally beginning to shift. She tucked the blackwood codicil into her bag, her fingers brushing the cool, heavy brass key Julian had provided from the archives, the key to the original Vance vault. "He wants me to be an embarrassment," she said, looking toward the window where the sun was beginning to dip behind the city skyline. "I'll give him a performance he'll never forget. 2 days, Julian. 2 days until Silas Vance finds out exactly what it feels like to lose everything." As she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, she didn't feel like the discarded ward Silas had tried to create. She felt like a storm. The countdown had begun, and the foundation of the Vance empire was already starting to crack. The following morning, the Vance estate felt like a gilded tomb, its air thick with the scent of floor wax and the suffocating weight of history. Elena Vance stood in the grand foyer, her fingers curled tightly around the heavy brass key in her pocket. The metal was cold, biting into her palm, a tactile reminder that the power dynamic in this house was about to shift. She had spent 5 years as a ghost in these halls, but today, every step she took felt like an act of war. She moved toward the basement stairs, avoiding the main gallery where Silas Vance was undoubtedly holding court over his morning espresso. She needed the ledgers. Julian Thorne had been clear. The codicil proved her ownership, but the ledgers would prove Silas's crimes. Without both, the trap wouldn't snap shut, it would only graze him. The air grew cooler as she descended, the smell of cedar and damp stone rising to meet her. The Vance vault wasn't a modern safe. It was a room-sized relic from a century ago, tucked behind a heavy oak door that Silas rarely bothered to check. He was too arrogant to believe anyone would dare challenge his sanctuary. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed through the quiet basement. Inside, the shelves were lined with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with age. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the dates. She found it tucked behind a stack of property tax records, the 2019 private ledger. She opened it, the smell of old ink and betrayal filling her senses. Her breath hitched. There it was, written in Silas's own aggressive, slanted hand. The systematic siphoning of the trust funds Martha Vance had intended for the estate's upkeep. Millions had been diverted into consulting fees paid to shell companies owned by Cassandra Vance. "Looking for your inheritance, Elena." The voice was like a whip crack in the small room. Elena didn't jump, though her pulse spiked. She slowly closed the ledger and turned to find Silas standing in the doorway. He looked impeccable in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire college tuition, his expression one of bored contempt. "This area is off limits," he said, stepping into the room. The smell of his expensive, woodsy cologne instantly soured the air. "But I suppose a beggar always returns to the scraps." "I was just looking for some of Martha's old journals," she said, her voice steady. She kept her hand resting on the ledger, shielding the date on the spine. Silas laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "My mother was a sentimental fool, and it seems she passed that trait on to you. It's pathetic, really. You've been lurking in this house for years, clinging to a name you don't deserve, hoping for a crumb of the legacy." He walked closer, invading her personal space until she could see the broken capillaries in his eyes, the only sign of the stress he was under. "Let me be clear. After the legacy gala in 2 days, you're out. I've already had the lawyers draft the eviction notice. You'll leave with exactly what you brought here. Nothing." Lena felt the familiar burn of rage, but she channeled it into a thin, sharp smile. 2 days, she repeated. "That's a very short time to get your affairs in order, Silas." His eyes narrowed. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Only that the Vance name carries a lot of weight," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It would be a shame if something happened to unbalance it. Silas snorted, reaching out to flick a piece of lint off her modest sweater. You're a charity case, Elena, a footnote in our history. You have no money, no allies, and certainly no power. You're lucky I haven't charged you rent for the air you breathe. He turned toward the door, pausing to look back over his shoulder. And don't bother coming to the gala in that rags and bones outfit. I've told security to keep the service entrance clear for people of your caliber. He stepped out, his footsteps receding up the stairs with the rhythmic arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world. Elena waited until the sound faded completely before she slumped against the cold stone wall. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She pulled her phone from her pocket and hit the speed dial for Julian. I have it, she said as soon as he picked up. The private ledger. He's been using Cassandra's name to drain the accounts for years. It's all here, Julian, every cent. Then we have him. Julian's voice was a calm anchor. I've finished verifying the codicil with the state archives. The land doesn't belong to the Vance Corporation, Elena. It belongs to you, personally. Silas has been signing contracts for property he doesn't legally own for over 3 years. He just threatened to evict me, she said, looking at the heavy ledger in her lap. He thinks he's delivering the final blow at the gala. Let him think that, Julian replied. Arrogance is a blindfold. He won't see the blade until it's already at his throat. Are you ready for the day after tomorrow? Elena stood up, tucking the ledger into her bag. She looked around the vault, no longer seeing a tomb but an armory. I've spent 5 years being the person he could ignore. I can wait 48 more hours. She walked out of the vault, locking the door behind her. As she climbed the stairs, she saw Beatrice Vance standing in the hallway, clutching a glass of wine even though it wasn't yet noon. Her aunt's eyes were glassy, filled with a desperate kind of pity. He's in a mood, Elena, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. Just stay out of his way until the gala is over. Maybe he'll give you a severance if you don't provoke him. Elena looked at her aunt, the woman who had watched Silas strip the family of its dignity and said nothing for the sake of her own comfort. I'm done staying out of the way, Beatrice, Elena said firmly. She walked past her, leaving the older woman blinking in the dim light of the hallway. 2 days. The countdown was no longer a threat. It was a promise. Silas Vance was planning a celebration of his own power, but Elena was planning a funeral for his empire. And the best part was, he was the one who had sent out the invitations. The afternoon before the Vance Legacy Gala, the grand ballroom smelled of floor wax and the suffocating, oversweet scent of 3,000 white lilies. Silas Vance stood on the mahogany dais, his silhouette framed by a massive silk banner bearing the family crest. A crest he had spent the last 5 years tarnishing with every forged signature and hidden debt. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the afternoon sun, and looked down at Elena as if she were a smudge on his polished floor. The caterers need to know their place, Elena, Silas said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't look at her. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in a silver serving tray. And so do you. Tomorrow night, you aren't a guest. You're a reminder of what happens when the weak try to cling to a name they didn't earn. You'll stay in the kitchens until I call for you to sign the final relinquishment papers in front of the board. Elena stood near the heavy velvet curtains, her fingers grazing the cool, hard edge of the burner phone in her pocket. On it was a single message from Julian Thorne. The injunction is signed. The forensic audit is complete. He has no idea the trap is already sprung. Are you sure about this, Silas? Elena asked. Her voice was unnervingly calm, a sharp contrast to the frantic energy of the decorators scurrying around them. The board is coming to celebrate the Vance legacy. If you go through with this public display, there's no turning back. You're putting everything on the line. Silas finally turned, a cruel, jagged smirk twisting his features. He stepped off the dais, his designer loafers clicking sharply on the marble. He stopped inches from her, the scent of expensive bourbon and arrogance radiating off him. I'm not putting anything on the line because I've already won. Cassandra's little. Habits. Cost us a fortune, and you're the perfect tax write-off. By the time I'm done with you tomorrow, the world will see you as the one who drained Martha's accounts. I'm the savior. You're the parasite." He reached out, flicking a stray thread off Elena's modest wool coat with a sneer. "You look like a beggar in your own house. It's fitting, really. Enjoy your last night of warmth. Once the papers are signed, security will escort you to the gates. I've already had the locks changed on the west wing." Elena didn't flinch. She watched a bead of sweat roll down his temple, the only sign of the pressure he was actually under, despite his bravado. Silas was a man standing on a glass floor, throwing stones at the only person holding the support beams. "I'll remember you said that," she whispered. "Good," he snapped, turning his back on her to bark orders at a florist. "Now get out of my sight. I have a legacy to cement." Elena walked toward the grand staircase, the sound of her own steady heartbeat drowning out the chaotic noise of his preparations. She passed the portrait of Martha Vance in the gallery. In the dim light, the matriarch's painted eyes seemed to track Elena's movement, no longer filled with the disappointment Silas tried to manufacture, but with a silent, steel-edged approval. Near the library, she found Julian Thorne waiting in the shadows. He handed her a leather-bound folder. The weight of it felt like a whetted blade. "Is it all there?" Elena asked, her voice low. "Every shell company, every diverted fund, and the proof that Silas used Cassandra's addiction to blackmail her into signing the land over," Julian said, his expression grim. "The board thinks they're coming for a coronation. They don't realize they're attending an inquest." Elena opened the folder, her eyes scanning the document Julian had spent weeks unearthing. It was the original deed to the estate, the one Martha had hidden in the foundation of the old carriage house. Silas thought he had burned the only copy. He didn't realize that Martha Vance never trusted a man who loved money more than his own blood. "He's planning to humiliate me at 10 o'clock tomorrow night," Elena said, closing the folder with a soft thud that felt like a gavel. "He wants the board to witness my confession before he kicks me out." "And what are you going to do?" Julian asked. Elena looked toward the ballroom, where Silas was currently laughing with a group of investors, his hand resting on a bottle of champagne that cost more than most people made in a year. "I'm going to let him have his stage," Elena said, her eyes turning to ice. "I want him to be at the very top of his mountain when I pull the earth out from under his feet. I want everyone to see his face when he realizes that the parasite just foreclosed on his life." She turned and walked toward her small room in the attic, leaving Julian in the hall. Tomorrow, the lilies wouldn't be for a gala. They would be for the death of a wolf. Elena sat on her narrow bed, the countdown echoing in the silence of the house. 24 hours. Silas Vance was about to learn that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice, but the one who has been listening the longest. The evening of the Vance Centennial Gala arrived with a chilling, calculated precision. The estate, once a sanctuary of Martha's quiet dignity, had been transformed into a garish theater of Silas Vance's making. Strings of amber lights draped across the limestone facade like golden chains, and the scent of heavy gardenias and expensive tobacco hung thick in the crisp night air. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers brushing the cold, heavy weight of the brass key tucked into the hidden pocket of her gown. It was a simple navy dress, devoid of the sequins and lace that defined the other women in the room, yet she felt more armored than she ever had in her life. She watched the sea of silk and wool part for the man of the hour. Silas Vance moved through the crowd like a predator who believed he had already won. He was draped in a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than the annual taxes on the estate, his Patek Philippe watch catching the overhead light with every practiced gesture. He was holding court near the mahogany bar, flanked by a group of investors who laughed a second too long at every one of his jokes. "Look at her," Silas said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding circle heard him. He didn't look at Elena directly, instead gesturing toward her with a half-full crystal flute of vintage Krug. "The prodigal daughter returns, dressed for a funeral while we celebrate a rebirth. I suppose some people just can't handle the sight of progress." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter followed. Elena didn't flinch. She met his gaze across the room, her expression a mask of placid indifference. She saw the flash of irritation in his eyes. The wounded wolf hated it when his prey refused to bleed on command. "The dress is appropriate, Silas," she said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the string quartet. "It's a night for endings and beginnings. I merely wanted to be prepared for both." He smirked, turning back to his cronies. "Spoken like someone who spends too much time in the attic with dust and memories. Why don't you go find Beatrice? She's in the solarium, probably trying to convince herself the gin is just flavored water." Elena turned away, her pulse a rhythmic drumbeat in her ears. She spotted Julian Thorne near the library entrance. He looked uncomfortable in a formal suit, his eyes scanning the room with the sharp intensity of a man who knew where the bodies were buried. When their eyes met, he gave a microscopic nod. The documents were in place. The legal trap was set, the jaws wide and waiting. As she moved through the crowd, the sensory overload of the gala felt like a fever dream. The sharp ping of silver spoons against crystal, the cloying sweetness of the lilies, and the frantic energy of the waitstaff created a veneer of prosperity that Elena knew was hollow. She passed Cassandra Vance, who was leaning heavily against a marble pillar, her eyes glazed and her pupils dilated. The golden child was vibrating with a nervous energy that suggested her secret habits were finally clawing their way to the surface. "You shouldn't be here, Elena," Cassandra hissed, her voice thinned by desperation. "Silas is going to announce the merger tonight. Once the papers are signed, there's nothing left for you. Not even the dirt this house is built on." "I know exactly what he's planning to sign, Cassandra," Elena replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that made the younger woman shiver. "The question is, do you know what you've already lost?" She left Cassandra staring into her empty glass and moved toward the back of the room, where Beatrice Vance sat on a velvet settee. Beatrice looked like a porcelain doll that had been left in the sun too long, beautiful from a distance, but cracked upon closer inspection. She was watching Silas with a mixture of pride and profound terror. "He looks so much like his father tonight," Beatrice murmured as Elena approached. "Strong, decisive." "He looks like a man who thinks the world is made of glass, Beatrice," Elena said, sitting beside her for a fleeting moment. "He forgets that glass doesn't just shine, it breaks." Beatrice gripped her pearl necklace, her knuckles white. "Don't ruin this, Elena. For once in your life, just let us have this win. We need the money. We need the stability." "Stability built on a lie is just a slow-motion fall," Elena said, standing up. She felt a strange surge of pity for the woman, but it was quickly eclipsed by the memory of Martha's final, ignored warnings. The clock on the mantel chimed, a deep, resonant sound that signaled the beginning of the formal toast. Silas stepped onto the small dais at the head of the ballroom, the light hitting him like a crown. He raised his hand, and the room fell into a practiced, expectant silence. Elena moved to the center of the floor, standing directly in his line of sight. She felt the vibration of her phone in her pocket, a single text from Julian. "The board has the files. The auditors are in the driveway." Silas cleared his throat, his face glowing with the intoxicating heat of his own ego. "Friends, family, and partners," he began, his voice booming with a confidence that made Elena's skin crawl. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate 100 years of the Vance name. We celebrate the future. A future where this estate, and the legacy my grandmother left behind, finally reaches its true potential under my singular vision." He paused for effect, his eyes locking onto Elena S. He smiled, a baring of teeth that was meant to be a final dismissal. "Some would see this land stay stagnant, trapped in the past by those who lacked the courage to lead. But tonight, that era ends." He reached for the leather-bound folder resting on the podium, the pen already in his hand. The witnesses leaned forward, some with greed, some with envy, all of them watching the stroke of the pen that would finalize the fraud. Elena took a single step forward, the brass key in her hand catching the light. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The silence in the room was so brittle that even her breath felt like a thunderclap. "Wait for it, Silas," she whispered, the words intended only for him. He froze, the pen hovering an inch above the signature line. His brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face as he realized Elena wasn't looking at him with defeat. She was looking at him with the cold, predatory patience of a hunter who had finally seen the wolf step into the light. In the distance, the muffled sound of heavy tires on the gravel driveway echoed through the open terrace doors. The countdown had reached 0. The heavy tires on the gravel weren't the arrival of more guests. They were the sound of the gates finally closing on a legacy of lies. Silas Vance didn't move, his hand still hovering over the fraudulent contract like a vulture interrupted mid-meal. He looked toward the terrace doors, his brow furrowing with the indignant confusion of a man who believed he owned the very air people breathed. "Security will handle whatever that is," he snapped, his voice tight with a sudden, sharp edge of anxiety. He turned back to the podium, trying to force a smile for the benefit of the board members. "As I was saying, this merger secures the Vance future. Elena, sit down. You're making a scene." Elena Vance didn't sit. She didn't even blink. She felt the cold, solid weight of the brass key in her palm, the key to the safe deposit box Julian Thorne had helped her locate just hours ago. The scent of expensive, over-perfumed lilies in the ballroom felt suffocating, but her own breath was steady. "I'm not making a scene, Silas," she said, her voice carrying a terrifying, quiet clarity that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "I'm providing the closing statement." The terrace doors swung open, but it wasn't security that stepped into the light of the chandeliers. Julian walked in, flanked by 2 men in dark, tailored suits who carried the unmistakable aura of federal oversight. He held a leather briefcase, his eyes locking onto hers with a brief, supportive nod before he turned his gaze toward the podium. "Who invited you?" Beatrice Vance gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat as she stood from the front row. She looked between her son and the newcomers, her face pale beneath her heavy makeup. "This is a private family event. It stopped being private the moment your son began using the Vance Charitable Trust as his personal slush fund," Julian replied, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Silas let out a jagged, condescending laugh. "This is a joke. Some local historian and my bitter sister playing detective. I have the signatures. I have the board's backing." "You have a forgery," Elena countered. She stepped toward the large projector screen that had been displaying the Vance Legacy slideshow. She didn't look at the guests. She looked only at her brother. "You thought Martha Vance left everything to you because you were the strong one. You thought she was as blind as you are." With a quick motion, Julian connected a small drive to the media console. The slideshow of smiling family photos flickered and died, replaced instantly by a high-resolution scan of a document with a deep, crimson seal. The room went deathly silent. It wasn't just a will. It was a land trust agreement dated 3 days before their grandmother's passing. Silas's face didn't just change. It seemed to physically erode under the weight of the truth. The practiced, arrogant smirk he had worn like armor for decades didn't just fade. It curdled into a mask of sickly, ash-colored terror. His jaw went slack, his lower lip trembling with a pathetic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't suppress, while a cold, greasy sweat broke out across his brow, glistening under the gala's chandeliers. The predatory sharpness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a frantic, hollow glaze as he looked from the screen back to the silent, judging crowd, his throat working convulsively as if he were trying to swallow the very evidence of his undoing. That's a fabrication," he croaked, but the sound was thin, lacking the booming authority he usually commanded. Beatrice's hand trembled so violently that her crystal flute slipped, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. Cassandra Vance took a stumbling step back, her face losing its curated glow, her mouth hanging open in a silent O of realization as she saw the specific clauses regarding her own allowance being revoked for cause. "The signatures on your merger documents are invalid, Silas," Elena said, walking toward him. She didn't stop until she was inches away, smelling the sour tang of his sudden fear over his expensive cologne. "Because you don't own the land. You never did. Martha left the estate and the controlling shares to the Vance Foundation, with me as the sole executor." The board members, who had been leaning in with greed moments ago, now pulled back. The shift was physical. They moved their chairs, creating a vacuum of space around the man who was suddenly a liability. "You spent so much time deciding who didn't belong in this family, Silas," she whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You forgot to check if the family still belonged to you." She turned away from him, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor. She didn't wait for his excuses or Beatrice's pleas. She walked toward Julian and the waiting officials. "The documents are in the study," she told the men in suits, her head held high. "And I believe you'll find the bank records quite illuminating." As she stepped out onto the terrace, the cool night air hit her face, smelling of rain and freedom. Behind her, she heard the first sounds of the real shouting match beginning, but she didn't look back. The countdown hadn't just reached 0, the explosion was already underway. She reached the gravel path where the black sedans were idling, their headlights cutting through the dark. It was over, but as she glanced at the dark windows of the upper floor, she realized the true cost of the Vance name was only just beginning to be tallied. 5 minutes had passed since the terrace doors clicked shut behind her, but the silence in the grand study was far from peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a structural collapse. Silas Vance stood behind the massive mahogany desk, his fingers trembling as he tried to straighten a stack of papers that no longer held any power. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the men in dark suits who were methodically opening his filing cabinets. "This is a mistake," Silas said, his voice cracking, though he tried to inject it with his usual venom. "Do you have any idea whose house you're standing in? I built this empire. I am the Vance legacy." Julian Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the bookshelf, clutching a leather-bound ledger that Silas hadn't seen in years. "Actually, Silas, you didn't build it. You bled it dry. And as for the house..." Julian paused, turning as the heavy oak doors swung open. Elena Vance stepped back into the room. She had shed the weight of her family's expectations outside on the gravel path, and she looked taller, her presence filling the space in a way Silas had never permitted. She didn't look angry, she looked finished. "The house belongs to the trust, Silas," Elena said, her voice a calm, rhythmic pulse in the tense room. "And as of 20 minutes ago, I am the sole administrator of that trust. Martha Vance made sure of that before she passed. She knew you'd try to sell the land to cover Cassandra's debts." Silas's face didn't just pale, it underwent a violent transformation. The arrogance that had defined his features for decades curdled into something unrecognizable. His skin, usually a pampered, healthy tan from seasons of golf and leisure, turned the sickly color of wet ash. The muscles in his jaw, once set in a permanent sneer of superiority, began to twitch uncontrollably, a rhythmic pulsing that betrayed the panic screaming behind his eyes. His lower lip, which had just been forming a scathing dismissal, trembled and went slack, revealing the uneven teeth he usually hid behind a practiced, predatory smile. Even his eyes, those cold blue chips of flint, seemed to recede into their sockets, losing their sharp focus as the reality of the documents before him shattered his carefully constructed delusion of invincibility. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a cornered animal realizing the cage was made of its own lies. Across the room, Beatrice Vance let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She reached for the back of a velvet armchair to steady herself, her manicured nails digging into the fabric. She looked at her husband as if seeing a stranger, the husband she had defended through every accounting error and minor legal hurdle. The realization that her comfort was tied to a sinking ship was written in the way she pulled her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders, physically distancing herself from the man at the desk. Cassandra Vance stood near the bar, her hand frozen on a crystal decanter. The glittering socialite, usually so quick with a sharp-tongued retort, looked hollow. The news of her own financial ruin, catalyzed by the father who had enabled her every vice, seemed to drain the very life from her. She didn't move to help him. She didn't even look at him. She stared at the empty glass in her hand, realizing the tap had finally run dry. "You're lying," Silas hissed, though the words lacked conviction. He turned to the lead official, a man with a gray tie and a face like granite. "Officer, my niece is unstable. She's been plotting this since the funeral. These documents are forgeries." The official didn't even look up from the laptop he had opened on the side table. "We've already verified the digital signatures with the state archives, Mr. Vance. The offshore accounts you've been using to siphon the estate's liquidity were flagged 4 hours ago. We have the wire transfer logs. Your signature is on every single one of them." The silence returned, heavier than before. Silas looked to Beatrice, his eyes pleading for the first time in his life. She didn't meet his gaze. She turned her head toward the window, her silence a deafening roar of abandonment. "Beatrice," he whispered. "I told you to be careful, Silas," she murmured, her voice devoid of emotion. "I told you Elena wasn't like the others." Elena walked toward the desk. She didn't stop until she was inches away from the man who had spent a lifetime trying to make her feel small. The scent of the coming rain drifted in from the terrace, mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of Silas's cold sweat. "You told me once that I didn't belong in this family because I didn't understand the cost of the Vance name," Elena said, her voice a low, lethal silk. "You were right. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. The cost is everything you're losing tonight." She reached out and picked up the heavy brass keys that sat on the corner of the desk, the keys to the estate, the offices, and the private vault. Silas reached for them, a pathetic, reflexive gesture, but she pulled them back before his fingers could brush the metal. "You have 1 hour to pack a single suitcase," Elena stated, her tone as final as a gavel. "Security will meet you at the gate to ensure you don't take anything that belongs to the trust. That includes the car, the watch, and the family signet." "You can't do this," Silas choked out, his posture collapsing as he sank into his leather chair. He looked small, the chair swallowing him. "I have nowhere to go." "Then I suggest you start walking," Elena replied. She turned her back on him, not waiting for a response, not needing one. She walked toward the door where Julian was waiting, the weight of the keys heavy and righteous in her hand. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard the first sounds of Silas's frantic, useless shouting begin again, but it was muffled by the closing of the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back. She didn't need to see the end to know it was final. But as she reached the bottom of the grand staircase, a new car pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the dark. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the lawyers. It was a vehicle she didn't recognize, and as the driver stepped out, holding a folder that looked older than the house itself, Elena realized that while Silas was gone, the true history of the Vance bloodline was only just beginning to surface. 6 months later, the Vance estate no longer smelled of stagnant cigars and the sharp, metallic tang of Silas's anxiety. Instead, the foyer was filled with the scent of rain-drenched earth and blooming jasmine, drifting in through windows that were finally allowed to stay open. The heavy velvet drapes that had once muffled the house's secrets had been stripped away, replaced by light linens that danced in the afternoon breeze. Elena Vance sat at the mahogany desk in the library, her fingers tracing the edge of a heavy iron key she now used as a paperweight. It was the key to the West Wing, a place she had once been forbidden to enter. Now, the entire house was hers, though it felt less like a kingdom and more like a responsibility. She had spent the last half-year untangling the web of fraud Silas Vance had spun, a process that had been as grueling as it was necessary. Her brother's fall had been absolute. Stripped of his titles and the majority of his ill-gotten assets, he was now living in a 40-square-meter studio apartment in the city's industrial district. His days were spent in courtrooms and meetings with bankruptcy trustees, his once-tailored suits replaced by off-the-rack polyester that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He had tried to send a letter 3 weeks ago, a rambling, 3-page demand for family maintenance, claiming that the emotional distress of the unlawful takeover had left him unable to work. Elena had read the first paragraph, felt a brief flash of the old, familiar rage at his bottomless entitlement, and then calmly fed the paper into the shredder. The rhythmic whir of the machine was the only response he would ever receive. The victory was sweet, but it had come with a ledger of costs she was still calculating. A soft knock at the door signaled the arrival of her mother. Beatrice Vance entered the room with a hesitant grace that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She was living in the gardener's cottage now, a small but elegant space on the far edge of the property. It was a self-imposed exile, a way to be near the legacy she had helped preserve through silence, while acknowledging she no longer had a seat at the head of the table. "The lawyers called," her mother said, her voice lacking its former sharp edge. She sat in the armchair opposite the desk, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "The settlement for the workers' pension fund is finalized. You've restored everything he took." "It was never ours to take, Mother," Elena replied softly. She looked at a framed photograph on the corner of her desk. It was a candid shot of her and Cassandra Vance from a decade ago, before the addictions and the greed had carved canyons between them. Cassandra was currently in a private recovery center in the mountains. Elena paid the invoices, but she hadn't visited. The trust was broken, and some things, unlike the estate's parquet floors, couldn't be sanded down and refinished. "I know," Beatrice said, her eyes drifting to the window. "I just didn't realize how much of the truth I was willing to trade for a quiet life. I look at you now, and I see Martha. She would have been proud of the way you handled that folder." The folder. Elena's gaze shifted to the safe in the corner. The documents Julian Thorne had brought that final night had changed everything. They hadn't just proven Silas's fraud, they had revealed a deeper truth about the Vance bloodline. The original charter, signed by their great-grandfather, had stipulated that the land was never meant to be a private hoarding of wealth. It was a trust, meant to be shared with the community in times of hardship. Silas hadn't just been stealing from the family, he had been violating a 100-year-old promise. Julian Thorne tapped on the doorframe, his presence a steadying force as he entered with a stack of blueprints. He had been her shadow through the transition, the historian who helped her find the heart of the house again. "The contractors are ready to start on the community garden project," he said, offering a warm smile that reached his eyes. "And the local school board approved the scholarship fund. The Vance name is starting to mean something else in town." "Good," Elena said, standing up. She felt the weight of the house, but it no longer felt like a burden pressing down on her shoulders. It felt like a foundation. She walked to the large bay window that overlooked the valley. In the distance, she could see the construction crews beginning to mark out the perimeter of the new public park. She had donated a third of the estate's acreage back to the township, ensuring the land would never again be a weapon used to make others feel small. Justice, she realized, wasn't a loud explosion or a grand celebration. It was the quiet, steady work of putting things back where they belonged. It was the ability to look in the mirror and see a person who had survived the wolves and come out stronger. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, Elena felt a final, lingering tie to the past snap. She was no longer the girl waiting for permission to exist. She was the woman who had built a sanctuary out of the ruins of a dynasty. She turned away from the window, ready to join Julian and her mother for a dinner that would be filled with talk of the future, leaving the ghosts of the Vance name exactly where they belonged, in the history books.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.